On the evening of December 8, 2001, 57-year-old Dr. Robert Schwartz stood in the kitchen of his farmhouse outside of Leesburg, Virginia, stirring strips of pork and vegetables in his frying pan. Robert could hear the rain beating against the windows, and the sound made him feel at peace. He had the heat cranked up, and he was wearing his most comfortable sweatpants. There was nowhere he would rather be on a rainy winter night than inside this home, which had been in his wife's family for generations. He checked the pork, which was almost done, and he reached for a single plate out of the cabinet. Robert used to love cooking, and until just a few years ago, he always made big portions to feed his family of 5. But his wife had died 4 years earlier from cancer, and her death had sent all 3 of their kids spiraling, especially their youngest, Clara, who was only 15 at the time. Clara was the one who actually found her mom on the morning she died, and she had fallen into a deep depression afterwards. Robert had been worried he might never pull her out, but recently, Clara seemed to have gotten into a really good groove. She was 19 now, and she had found a tight-knit group of friends who all loved Renaissance fairs, where people dress up like they're from medieval times. Clara had created a fantasy game called Underworld, and the kids all spent a lot of time playing it. Robert didn't really understand the game, but he was thrilled that Clara had finally discovered something to be passionate about. These days, Clara was away at college, along with her older sister, Michelle, and her older brother, Jesse. And Robert was proud of how he had pulled the kids through their mother's death. He felt like he had sent them out into the world as basically happy and capable people, which was a goal that had seemed very far away in the early period of their grief. He did miss them, though. Most nights now, he ate alone, with the creaking of the old house to keep him company. His kids had always complained about all the noises the house made, but Robert liked it. He spent his days working long hours as a biophysicist studying DNA at a science and technology firm called the Center for Innovative Technology, where the offices and laboratories were white and brightly lit and pretty quiet. Robert loved his work, but the environment was a little sterile for his taste. So, coming home to an overgrown farmhouse way out in the woods, where vines grew up the stone walls and the floorboards squeaked and the nearest neighbors were more than a quarter mile away, was a nice contrast. Now, he set his plate down and reached into a bag of tortillas on the counter. He put 2 in the middle of the plate, and then he started to tip the frying pan to scoop out the meat and vegetables on top. But before he could turn off the burner and head to the table, he heard a knock coming from the front door. Robert frowned and craned his neck to look toward the door, which had a little window in it, but the rain made it impossible to see out. Robert did not get a lot of unexpected visitors, especially not on a stormy night like this, but he figured maybe it was just a delivery driver trying to keep a package from getting soaked. But whoever it was knocked again, and so Robert turned and walked out of the kitchen and through the front room toward the entryway. The knocking had gotten fast and loud by the time Robert made it to the front door, flipped the lock, and swung the door open. Two days later, on December 10th, 2001, at around 1:15 on Monday afternoon, a man named Sam Welsh, who lived down the street from Robert Schwartz, was loading laundry into his washing machine when his phone rang. Sam abandoned the laundry and walked into his kitchen to pick it up. When he said hello, he heard the voice of a friend, and his friend sounded pretty anxious. This friend worked at the Center for Innovative Technology, which is where Robert worked, and the friend said that Robert hadn't come into work today. He had missed an important meeting, and he wasn't answering his phone. And this was about as out of character as it was possible to get for Robert, who was famous in the field of DNA research and had actually worked on the first online database of DNA sequence information. Robert was organized, reliable, and extremely communicative. He never just went silent. So this friend asked Sam, "Can you please go to Robert's house to check to see if he's okay?" Sam didn't hesitate. He said of course he would. Then he hung up the phone, went out to his truck, and drove to Robert's farmhouse, which was about a mile away at the end of a dead-end road. When Sam pulled up, he saw Robert's car parked on the street, and a construction crew digging up Robert's driveway in front of the house. Everything looked calm and normal, which Sam found encouraging. He recognized one of the workers as another neighbor of his, so he parked his truck, hopped out, and went over to ask if the worker had seen Robert. But the worker said no. The construction crew had arrived almost 6 hours earlier at 7:30 that morning, and not only had Robert not come out to greet them all like he normally did, they hadn't actually seen any movement at all inside of his house. Now, the brief sense of relief Sam had felt when he arrived evaporated. He explained to the construction worker about the concerning call he'd just gotten, and so he asked the worker to come with him to go check on Robert. The two men walked down the driveway toward the farmhouse. They knocked on the front door, but nobody answered. So they went around to the side door, which Sam knew Robert usually left unlocked. Sam didn't want to just barge in, so when they got to the side door, he first knocked loudly. But again, nobody answered. Sam shot a worried look at the construction worker, and then he tried the knob. And just like he'd expected, the door was unlocked. Sam stepped inside and called out Robert's name, but the house was completely silent. So he took a few halting steps. Ahead of him, he could see the kitchen. Sam called out Robert's name again and took one more step forward, right up to the threshold of the kitchen, and then he froze. For a long second, Sam stood there completely still, not even breathing, with the construction worker a few paces behind him. Then, Sam whirled around and gave the worker a shove back towards the door. Sam was so afraid that he could barely think, but he managed to shout one single sentence: "Call the police!" Loudoun County investigator Greg Locke was sitting in a classroom in a local school near Leesburg, Virginia, halfway through his first day of a week-long police training course when his pager vibrated. And when Locke looked down at the short message blinking on his little screen, he felt his heart start to race. He stood up and gathered his things, told the instructor he was sorry but he had to go, then speed-walked out of the classroom. Locke had only been with the Loudoun County Sheriff's Department for a couple of months. He had originally planned on becoming a firefighter, but training for that position had required that he go to the local police academy. And in the police academy, Locke had realized that he actually preferred the slow, puzzle-solving nature of detective work over the fast-paced intensity of firefighting. So he had switched careers entirely and joined the sheriff's department. He started off in the crime lab, but he just transferred to the homicide unit, which was actually why he was taking this class. Now, Investigator Locke pushed open the front door of the school building where his class was happening and jogged the rest of the distance to his cruiser. He got in, turned the ignition, and peeled out of the parking lot, headed west toward the big old farmhouse in the woods. When Locke pulled up on the dead-end street, he saw the flashing blue and white lights of a sea of police cruisers. It looked like the entire sheriff's department was there. Locke got out of his cruiser and walked down the long driveway and up the front steps of the farmhouse. The front door was open, and as Locke stepped through the entryway, he could tell that the scene was pretty well covered by police and crime scene techs. So he looked for a supervisor to get a rundown of exactly what they were dealing with. Locke found his supervisor standing just outside the kitchen, staring grimly at a man's bloody body. At first glance, it was immediately clear to Locke that whatever had happened here to this man, it had been a frenzy of violence. The man's body lay face down on the floor. His clothing had been shredded in the attack, and there was so much blood that it had dried in sticky thick pools that spread out all over the hardwood. Even the bottom of the man's white socks were bloody, which Locke knew meant there must have been a struggle, because the only way for the bottom of his socks to get that soaked was if he had been bleeding heavily and then stepped in it. Locke's supervisor turned away from the body and brought Locke quickly up to speed. Their victim was Dr. Robert Schwartz, who was a well-known biophysicist, and he had been stabbed to death. It didn't appear to be a robbery, because nothing had been stolen or rifled through, and there was no sign of forced entry, which meant that, very likely, Robert had opened the door to his attacker willingly. Locke knew that a set of facts like this often meant that a murder victim had been targeted by a person they knew, rather than attacked by a random stranger. And the savagery of the stabbing itself supported that theory, because it suggested a highly emotional killer who felt true rage towards the victim. But Locke's supervisor told him there was one more thing, something incredibly bizarre. Whoever had stabbed Dr. Schwartz to death had also carved an X into the back of his neck. Locke told his supervisor that he was going to start canvassing the neighborhood, and his supervisor nodded in agreement. As Locke walked back out the front door of the farmhouse, he looked around and shook his head incredulously. This was a beautiful area. It was up in the mountains, and it was sitting right above a historic little downtown district with nice restaurants and breweries and coffee shops and a vibrant art scene. It was very hard to imagine any murder taking place here, let alone some kind of ritual killing that involved a vicious knife attack and a symbol carved into the victim's skin. The nearest house was way down the road, and as Locke reached it and climbed the front steps, he realized he couldn't even see Robert's home from here. This gave him a sinking feeling. He was afraid that the people inside of this house could not have possibly heard anything going on inside of Robert's house a quarter-mile away. None of the neighbors could have. But Locke knocked anyway, and soon a middle-aged married couple answered, looking concerned. They said they had seen all the commotion, and they asked if everything was okay. Inspector Locke just shook his head and said no. There had been an incident, but he couldn't say anything about it right now. Locke told the couple that what he had come for was to ask if they had seen or heard anything suspicious over the weekend. He watched as the couple exchanged a look. Yes, the husband said. As a matter of fact, they did. On Saturday night, during the rainstorm, a soaking wet teenage boy had come to their house asking to use the phone because his car got stuck in the mud a little ways down the road. The husband said he had looked outside and seen the car, which had a young woman and man inside, and then he said he called a towing company that he knew, and the teenager had thanked him and gone back to the car to wait, and the tow truck driver had arrived not long after. Locke scribbled this down in his notepad, then asked the husband what exactly was strange about the encounter. It wasn't uncommon at all in an area this rural for cars to get stuck. The husband nodded in agreement, but it wasn't the car getting stuck that was strange, he said. It was where the car was driving in the first place. The teenagers had gotten stuck on a dead-end road. There was literally nothing down there, except for Robert Schwartz's house. So, the husband asked, what were the teenagers doing down there? Locke left the neighbor's home and checked in by phone with his supervisor to share what he'd just heard about the kids in the mud on Saturday night. And his supervisor was instantly interested because the medical examiner had just come and collected the body, and his initial examination suggested that the murder had happened on Saturday night too. And Locke's supervisor told him that the medical examiner had also discovered something else that was pretty unusual. When he had rolled Robert's body over, he found deep marks in the wood underneath where he had been laying. This was important because it looked like the marks had been made by the knife used to kill Robert. In other words, this could not have just been a regular knife, like you would find in a regular kitchen. Instead, the knife the killer had used had such a long blade that when the killer plunged it into Robert's torso, it had gone all the way through his body and then into the floor beneath him, leaving the marks. That meant the murder weapon had a blade that was at least 2 feet long. Now, the murder weapon had not been found inside of the home, so it looked like the killer had brought the long blade with them to the house and then taken it with them when they left. To Locke and his supervisor, the idea of the murder weapon being this long, strange blade only strengthened their fear that this murder might have a ritualistic or even satanic element to it. But Locke told his supervisor that before they went down a rabbit hole of the occult, they should focus on something a bit simpler that was right in front of their faces. They should track down those teenagers and the tow truck driver. Locke got in his cruiser and drove to the office of the towing company, where he found the owner in the lobby. Locke asked him if he remembered a call on Saturday night about a carload of teenagers stuck in the mud on a dead-end street. As soon as the owner heard this, he scowled. Yeah, he said, I remember. Those kids stiffed my driver on the bill. And now, Locke felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the second suspicious thing he learned about the kids in the stuck car. Not only were they driving down a dead-end road they had no business being on, but they ducked out on the towing bill. Now, stiffing the driver was a crime, but Locke wondered if they had done it because they wanted to avoid giving out their real names. Locke asked the owner if he could speak to the driver, and the owner said sure, then disappeared into the back office. A few minutes later, a man in a t-shirt with the towing company's logo on it walked out into the lobby and said he was the one who helped those kids. Locke could see from the man's furrowed brow and darting eyes that he was nervous, like he had something sensitive or upsetting to say. And Locke wondered if he was about to break this case open right here, right now. The tow truck driver gestured to Locke to follow him to the far corner of the lobby furthest away from the back office where his boss was. When they got there, well out of earshot of the boss, the driver started to mumble something about how he'd gone out in the rain and unstuck the car and the kids jumped in and took off without paying, but then he stopped and looked around like he was making sure they were alone. Once he was satisfied they had real privacy, the driver leaned into Locke and said, I'll tell you something, but you can't tell my boss. Locke quickly nodded yes, completely desperate for the driver to continue. Whatever he was about to say, Locke wanted to hear it. Well, the tow truck driver said slowly, I lied. The tow truck driver explained that the kids did not stiff him on the bill. In fact, they were perfectly nice and polite, and they didn't seem upset in any way, and they had gone to an ATM to get cash to pay the bill. The driver had decided to lie about the kids running off just so he could pocket the cash. And at this, Locke felt himself deflate. He could see his theory of teenagers driving around, committing crimes, and trying to hide their identities slipping away. Locke suppressed an urge to roll his eyes at the tow truck driver, and instead promised he wouldn't say anything to the man's boss. He asked if the driver had the kids' names, and the driver said yes. He kept a log of all his jobs, so he had the driver's name and license number. He also remembered the bank they went to for the ATM. Locke scribbled down the information, thanked the tow truck driver, and then went back to headquarters. Back at his desktop computer, Locke looked up the teenage driver, whose name was Michael Foale. He was hoping to discover that this kid was some kind of serious criminal, but instead, he saw a skinny 21-year-old college student with no record. He made a pretty unlikely murder suspect. Locke leaned back, feeling disappointed. His hope for a simple explanation for the murder, instead of an occult ritual, was fading fast. He checked the time and realized it was now mid-afternoon, and he still hadn't talked to the victim's family yet. He decided he would finish running down the final details on the kids in the car the next day. Right now, he had to go find Robert Schwartz's 3 children and tell them that their father had been murdered. The drive to James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia took about 2 hours, and it was dark by the time Locke pulled onto campus. Both of Robert Schwartz's daughters, his youngest daughter Clara and her older sister Michelle, were students here. And as Locke parked in front of the residence hall, he saw the campus police officer and the university counselor he had contacted to help with the notification waiting for him. They led Locke into the residence hall, up a flight of stairs, and down a hallway to Clara's dorm. The campus police officer knocked and then stepped aside, so Locke could lead the conversation. The door opened, and Locke saw a young girl in baggy clothes with stringy brown hair and red bloodshot eyes. It looked like she'd been awake for days, and he suddenly felt for this teenager, whose life he knew he was about to change completely. He introduced himself and told her he had something important to tell her, but that she should sit down first. He watched as Clara nervously backed up and then sat on the edge of her bed. Then, Locke took a deep breath, and in a quiet and steady voice, he told Clara the news. Her father was dead. For what felt like a very long time, the room was completely silent. Clara stared blankly at Locke, for so long that Locke started to wonder if she'd even understood him. But right before Locke was about to ask her if she was okay, Clara's eyes seemed to snap back into focus, and she finally spoke. She asked how did her dad die. And now, Locke hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He knew he had to be mindful about how much he revealed about the crime, even to the victim's closest family members. Everyone was a possible suspect until they were ruled out. So, Locke told Clara that her father had been found dead inside of his home, and what happened to him was a question they were investigating. Clara went back to staring blankly. Locke could tell Clara was in some kind of shock, and so there was no way he was going to leave her alone. So he asked her to come with him because now they had to go and tell her sister, Michelle. A few minutes later, Locke stood inside of Michelle's dorm room as Michelle screamed the word no over and over again while Clara tried to comfort her. So far, telling the kids had been just as heart-wrenching as Locke had expected. Notifications were one of the hardest parts of his job, especially in a murder, because Locke couldn't just comfort them and leave. Instead, he had to stay and question them, no matter how upset they were. Locke looked at Michelle and Clara and decided that of the two of them, Clara was in much better shape to be interviewed. So he asked her to please step out of the room so he could ask her a few questions. Clara nodded, and Locke led her out into the hallway to a quiet corner near the stairwell where it felt like they had some privacy. He pulled out his notepad and asked Clara when she last talked to her father. Clara looked down at the floor and shook her head sadly. Friday, she said. They had talked about her coming home for the holidays in a few weeks. Then she paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was almost a whisper. She said that during that last conversation, she and her father had fought. She had a car, but it was back at the farmhouse, and she wanted to bring it to school, but her dad wouldn't let her. She looked up at Locke and told him that she didn't know why she had gotten so upset at him. Her dad had promised to consider it over the holidays, so she didn't even know why she blew up at him. Now, her final conversation with her father would always be this stupid argument. Locke watched as Clara dropped her head again. He felt sorry for the stunned and awkward teenager. He told Clara he hated to keep pressing, but he needed to know about her father's friends and relationships, and about the people that she and her siblings hung out with. He asked if anyone they knew might have had some kind of grudge against her father. At this, Clara screwed up her face in what looked like deep concentration. Then she slowly listed off the names of some of her dad's closest friends, but said none of them had a grudge, and most of her friends had either never met her dad, or if they had, they really liked him. But then, Locke watched as Clara's expression changed. It looked like she had just remembered something else, and suddenly she looked straight at Locke with a focus in her eyes that he hadn't seen until now. She said one of her friends had recently met her dad over Thanksgiving break, and ever since then, he'd been acting really strange and intense. She told Locke that his name was Kyle Hulbert. He was 18, and they had met at a Renaissance fair a few months earlier. They'd gotten along really well at first, but over the last several weeks, his whole demeanor had changed, although she didn't know why. He'd actually gotten busted on a concealed weapons charge for carrying daggers around a shopping mall, and after that, Clara said she had tried to avoid him. At the mention of daggers, Locke's eyes narrowed. This murder case involved an unusual blade as the murder weapon, and while daggers weren't long like the murder weapon, they were an unusual knife to carry, especially at the mall. Locke's disappointment over the teenagers and the tow truck disappeared as he underlined Kyle Hulbert and daggers in his pad. This was a good lead. He told Clara they were almost done, and soon she could go back with her sister and they could tell their brother together. But first, he needed to know the names of Kyle's closest friends. Clara nodded and started listing off names, which Locke wrote down as quickly as he could. But when Clara got to the last name, Locke's pencil froze on the page. Because Locke knew he had heard this name before. Just a few hours earlier, in fact, when he was standing in the tow truck company lobby. It was Michael Foale, the teenage driver of the stuck car. The next day, December 11th, Locke had Michael Foale picked up by police officers when he left his house with his girlfriend in the car. Officers took both of them to the station, put them in separate rooms, and told them to wait. Someone would be in to question them soon. Meanwhile, Locke executed a search warrant at Michael's house, where police seized a desktop computer, 2 black cloaks, multiple knives, a document about human sacrifice, and a sword with a blade more than 2 feet long with little flecks of blood still on the metal. That afternoon, when Locke walked into the interview room where Michael was waiting, he felt like he had a pretty good case. Now, he just needed Michael to talk. And pretty much the second he sat down, Locke got his wish. Michael Foale and his girlfriend agreed to tell Locke everything they knew. But their story was more bizarre and more horrific than Locke or anyone else had expected. In fact, it was so wild and so shocking that it would take several more weeks of investigation before Locke and the rest of the police were able to fully untangle the sequence of events that Michael Foale and his girlfriend sketched out in their interviews that day. But finally, on February 1st, 2002, so almost 2 months after Robert Schwartz's death, the police arrested the mastermind behind the murder. And it was not who the police had expected it to be. Based on interviews, evidence, and transcripts from online and phone conversations, the following is what happened to Dr. Robert Schwartz on the night of Saturday, December 8th, 2001. At around 6:15 p.m., the killer sat in the back seat of a car, driving down a muddy dead-end road in the woods in a rainstorm. The killer's friend, Michael Foale, was driving, and Michael's girlfriend was riding in the front passenger seat. Michael and his girlfriend were both talking because they were trying to find the big old farmhouse that was their destination, but the killer was not paying attention to them. Instead, the killer was completely focused on a different voice, a voice that no one else could hear. The voice was named Nicodemus, and Nicodemus was a god. In fact, Nicodemus was one of 6 gods that had lived inside the killer's head for as long as the killer could remember. And now, Nicodemus had a warning. "Don't go up there," Nicodemus shouted inside of the killer's head. Now, usually, the killer listened to Nicodemus. The killer knew the god was just trying to keep them safe, but tonight, the killer knew they could not back down from their plan. Innocent lives were at stake, because the killer knew something that no one else did. And that was that Dr. Robert Schwartz was a monster. He lashed out with violence even though no one else could see it, and he poisoned lemons and pork with sulfuric acid. And recently, the killer was absolutely certain that Dr. Robert Schwartz had begun planning a murder of his own. The killer knew they had to strike first. So, from the backseat of the car, the killer answered Nicodemus, telling the god in a whisper, "I have to do this." The car came to a stop in the mud in front of Robert Schwartz's farmhouse, and the killer got out wearing a long black trench coat that hid a 27-inch long sword. The killer stalked through the rain up to Robert's front door and started knocking, hard. After a minute, the killer heard footsteps squeaking on old hardwood inside the house, and then the door opened. The killer could smell the dinner that Robert was cooking in the kitchen. Robert stood in the doorway, looking down at the killer in confusion. "Yes?" he asked. The killer asked if Clara was home, and Robert said no. So the killer asked for Clara's phone number, and Robert invited the killer inside out of the rain while he wrote it down. And this was when the killer decided to strike. As Robert stood with his back to the killer, writing out his daughter's phone number, the killer told him, "I know your plans." And as Robert turned in confusion, the killer pulled out the sword and began slashing. Robert tried to protect himself, grabbing for the blade and cutting his hand in the process, spilling blood all over the floor, but the killer was in an unstoppable frenzy. The killer yanked the sword away from Robert and then slashed his stomach. Somehow, Robert stayed standing as the killer swung the sword and sprayed blood across the kitchen. Some of the blood landed in the killer's mouth, and the metallic taste filled the killer with pleasure and adrenaline. The killer slashed Robert over and over until finally Robert fell, landing face down on the hardwood. Robert wasn't moving anymore, and Nicodemus was screaming at the killer to stop, but the killer couldn't stop. Some of Robert's blood had landed on the hot stove, where it was now sizzling, and the smell filled the air as the killer rammed the sword all the way through Robert's body over and over again, sinking the tip of the blade into the hardwood beneath Robert. By the time the killer finished, Robert's clothing was shredded and he had been stabbed more than 30 times. The killer stood over his victim for a minute and then calmly walked over to the stove to turn off the burner. And then before he left the house, as a final touch, the killer took the sword and carved an X into the back of Robert's neck. The killer did this because X was the signature of an assassin in the fantasy game that the killer loved. That fantasy game was called Underworld. Underworld had been created by the killer's best friend, and it was the killer's best friend who was the mastermind behind the murder of Robert Schwartz. In the game of Underworld, the mastermind went by the name High Priestess of Chaos, and the killer was called Assassin. But in the real world, the killer's name was Kyle Hulbert, and the mastermind's name was Clara Schwartz. It would turn out Robert Schwartz's daughter, Clara, had never come out of her depression after the death of her mother. Instead, she sunk deep into misery and also paranoia and became convinced that her father was trying to kill her. And when Clara met Kyle Hulbert at a Renaissance fair, she found a willing player in her dark fantasy world. Kyle was schizophrenic and bipolar, and he'd grown up in foster care and mental hospitals, totally unable to tell the difference between reality and the voices and visions inside of his head. Clara and Kyle, along with Michael Foale and his girlfriend, formed a disturbed little family. They all played characters in Clara's fantasy game, Underworld, and they referred to each other as brother and sister. And over time, Clara had convinced all of them that her father was trying to poison her by lacing lemons and pork with chemicals like sulfuric acid, and that he was ultimately planning to murder her. And so, convinced that Clara was in real danger, Kyle, the underworld assassin, stepped in to protect her. But what Clara did not say to Kyle was that if her father died, she believed she would inherit several $100,000. And so, at Clara and Kyle's instruction, Michael and his girlfriend drove Kyle to Robert Schwartz's house in the rainstorm on December 8, 2001, so that Kyle could stop Robert once and for all. And they might have gotten away with their crime if their car had not gotten stuck in the mud. In the end, Michael Foale was sentenced to 18 years in prison for his role in the murder. His girlfriend accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to just 1 year. Kyle pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and conspiracy and was sentenced to life in prison. And although Clara Schwartz tried to pin the whole murder on Kyle by dropping his name and the story about his arrest for carrying daggers to investigator Locke, she was ultimately caught when police read transcripts of her online and phone conversations with Kyle and her other friends. It was clear that Clara herself was the driving force behind the murder of her father. She was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy and sentenced to 48 years in prison. In a final twist, it was the DNA research that Dr. Robert Schwartz himself had spent his career on, which helped investigators to determine that the blood on the sword belonged to Robert. Before The Bachelorette pitted 30 men against each other to win one woman's heart, Americans watched another show about random strangers competing for a mate. It was called The Dating Game. Starting in 1965, this reality show featured a woman asking 3 men questions without seeing their faces, and based on their answers, at the end of the show, she would choose one to go on a date with. On the surface, the September 13th, 1978 showing of The Dating Game looks like every other episode with lots of unsubtle innuendo, but this episode would go down in history as a one-of-a-kind, and not in a good way. At the end of this particular show, it was time for the Bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw, to make her decision, and she would choose Bachelor number 1, who would turn out to be this tall, good-looking, long-haired guy whose name was Rodney. Rodney comes around the partition, and they see each other for the first time, and everybody laughs, and they hug, and the show looks like every other show, and on stage, Rodney looks like every other contestant that's ever been on the show. But after the show ended and Cheryl and Rodney went backstage and actually began having a real conversation that was not being filmed, Cheryl would say that Rodney completely changed. He became incredibly creepy and was saying things like, "I always get the girl." And then at some point he says, "Hey, you should come out with me tonight. It'll be a date you'll never forget." And she turns to him and just says, "No thanks." This would turn out to be a really wise decision because Rodney was a horrible, horrible person. Had the show done a background check on Rodney, they would have discovered that he assaulted an 8-year-old and went to jail for 3 years for it and was currently on parole. But even if they had done a background check on Rodney, the check would not have discovered what he did at night. Rodney was shamelessly cocky and self-confident, and unlike a lot of men, he had no issue walking right up to any woman anywhere and flirting with her. And he used that to his advantage. He would go up to women in bars and he would convince them that he was a fashion photographer and that they were so beautiful, would you come back to my apartment and do a photo shoot with me? And just like Cheryl on the dating show, these women were immediately kind of charmed by him and would say yes. Once they got back to his apartment, he would shut and lock the door and then become that creepy guy that Cheryl saw backstage. But unlike Cheryl, who at the time she saw this just said, "I'm not interested," and was able to leave, these women were trapped. And then whether they wanted to or not, they would do a photo shoot with him and then he would strangle them to death. Because Rodney Alcala was not your typical dating game contestant. He was a serial killer who, by the time he stepped foot on that show and was chosen by Cheryl Bradford to win the game, he had already killed 4 people. In over a 2-year period, he killed as many as 130 people, which, if you're doing the math, is over those 2 years, he was killing at least 1 person a week. Alcala was finally apprehended and he was sentenced to death. Our next story is called Something Scratching. On the afternoon of June 1st, 2018, 36-year-old Luis Garcia headed into Mexico City to meet up with his older brother. The two of them were very close. They had been through a lot together. When Luis was 14 years old and his older brother was 15, their parents had gone through a really messy divorce, and during it, their father had just walked out on them and they never saw him again. And shortly after that, their mother remarried and her new husband moved in with the family, and shortly after that, their mother just vanished. And the boys, they asked their stepfather, like, "Where is she? Where's she gone?" But the stepdad would say, "I don't know, she went out on an errand and she never came back." And the boys, they were very suspicious of their stepfather because this did not feel like something their mom would do, like she would not abandon them. But just a couple of days after their mom disappeared, their stepfather disappeared too. And so all of a sudden, these teenage boys are just left to fend for themselves. Now, the boys would contact police, and specifically they said, hey, we think something happened to our mom. We think maybe our stepdad had something to do with it, but everybody's abandoned us. And the police would launch an investigation, and they would go looking for their mother, but they couldn't find her. And they couldn't find the stepfather or the biological father. And so after the police wound down their investigation, the two boys, again, they've been orphaned now, and they, learned to fend for themselves, but they never stopped looking for their mom. For nearly 2 decades, they continued to search Mexico City for their mother, and they just could never get any sort of closure. They really didn't know what happened to her. And so today, the two brothers had met up, not to go looking for their mom, but instead to meet at their childhood home. So after their mother and stepfather and their biological father had abandoned them, the two boys had lived in the childhood home on their own, fending for themselves. They had grown up there. And then eventually, when they were old enough, they had moved out and started their own adult lives on their own, but they had never sold the house. They had just kind of kept it in their possession and let it sit there. But now they were going back to, go through and sort of clean it up and, decide if they wanted to do some renovations and just kind of fix the place up, maybe to sell it. They didn't know. And so the two brothers, they met up at the home, they go inside, and there's still photos on the wall, old family photos, and there's, all these memories that come rushing back, many of which are very sad and troubling, but, the brothers, they're having a good time, just kind of going down memory lane. And at some point, they decide, okay, you know what? Not only are we going to clean this place out, but also there's some basic renovations that really need to happen here. Like the place has been sitting here for years, it's sort of fallen into disrepair, let's fix this place up. And so over the next couple of days, they would call in some contractors to begin to do some basic renovations in the house, while the brothers continued to clean it up and pack things up and sort of get it ready for whatever it was going to be. And on one particular day, when a group of contractors were working in the master bedroom, the brothers were in the living room doing their own thing when they heard a big commotion coming from the master suite. One of the contractors began yelling for the brothers to get in here and look at what he had found. It's the two brothers, they got up, they bolt into the master's suite, and they look at something that was just sitting on the ground. And at first, they didn't even know what they were looking at. But then the contractor, after composing himself, told them what it was. And suddenly, the boys understood what had happened to their mother. It would turn out the brothers were right. Their mother had not simply gone out and abandoned her sons. Instead, on the day their mother left and never came back again, somehow or another, she was bound and gagged and stuffed inside the wall of their family home. And we know this because when that contractor 2 decades later was doing renovations for the brothers inside that home, his sledgehammer went into the wall in the master suite, and when he pulled it out again, a white object came tumbling out of the wall. And that object was their mother's skull. And after pulling apart the wall and looking inside, they would find the rest of her skeleton clearly bound and gagged. And then perhaps most disturbingly of all is that in the wall, they would also find all these scratch marks, suggesting she was alive when she was put in there, which means she was in there desperately trying to get the attention of her sons to save her, but nobody could hear her. Following this horrific discovery, the two brothers went to police in Mexico City and told them what happened. And the police would come to the house, they would look all over the place and try to figure out, what happened to their mother, who killed her. But they couldn't solve it. Now, the police always did suspect that the stepfather very likely had some level of involvement here, just given the fact that he himself went missing a couple of days after the mother did. But they could never locate him, and very likely they never will, because today he'd be well over 90 years old and is very likely already dead. The next and final story of today's episode is called Be Still Their Hearts. On May 27, 2022, an anesthesiologist named Dr. Chad Marsden stood inside of an operating room with a nurse, a surgeon, and their unconscious patient. Dr. Marsden worked at the Baylor Scott & White Surgicare Center in Dallas, Texas, and it was his job to make sure patients stayed asleep during surgery and then woke up safely afterward. That day, Dr. Marsden and his colleagues were wrapping up a routine liposuction procedure on a middle-aged woman. The surgeon had just finished stitching up the woman's incisions, and so Dr. Marsden, following protocol, began taking her slowly off of anesthesia to wake her back up again. And so Dr. Marsden turned off the anesthesia machine, which is this big rectangular device that takes the liquid anesthesia drugs and converts it into a vapor so it can be breathed in. And then Dr. Marsden removed the breathing mask from the woman's face. Then he changed her IV from an anesthetic drug mixture to regular saline. And so now that these drugs were not being pumped into her system, she would wake up over the next half hour or so. After that, Dr. Marsden and the nurse and the surgeon took their patient on the stretcher, and they pushed her out of the OR into the hallway and began making their way down towards the recovery room. But as they were walking down this hallway, they bumped into more of their colleagues, another nurse and another anesthesiologist, and the hallway was tight enough that Dr. Marsden had to step aside to let these two pass. And then after they did, and they sort of waved at their colleagues, Marsden, the nurse, and the surgeon continued walking, and as they did, Marsden happened to look down at their patient, and immediately he knew something was wrong. This woman's skin had turned completely gray. Dr. Marsden was totally caught off guard by this. He looked at her vital sign monitor and saw that her blood pressure, which just moments ago had been normal, was now dangerously high. And then as he's staring at her monitor, her blood pressure plummeted. And then also her oxygen levels fell, and then she began foaming at the mouth. It was clear this woman was going into cardiac arrest, which meant if they didn't act quickly, her heart was going to stop. Now, Dr. Marsden, again, is sort of in shock at how quickly this is happening, but he just jumped into protocol. He began giving the woman chest compressions to make sure blood was flowing to her heart. Meanwhile, the surgeon administered oxygen and blood pressure medication, and the nurse called for an ambulance. The reason she had to call for an ambulance is because the Surgicare Center was not equipped to handle medical emergencies. It was only for scheduled surgeries. And so if there was a medical emergency, all they could do was just stabilize the patient until paramedics arrived. And that's exactly what Dr. Marsden, the nurse, and the surgeon did. They got this woman stable, and then just a minute later, two paramedics came running down the hallway. They took possession of the patient, they put her onto their stretcher, out the door they went, they put her in the back of the ambulance, and they sped off to the local hospital. As Dr. Marsden watched the ambulance disappear down the road, he knew his patient was now in good hands, but he was still very shaken by the whole experience. Because this type of emergency, somebody going into unexplained sudden cardiac arrest following a totally routine surgery, was extremely rare. Meaning, for this to happen even just once over the course of somebody's medical career, to have witnessed something like that, was very rare. But for Dr. Marsden, this was not the first time he had seen this. In fact, literally the day before, a different patient at the Surgicare Center had also gone into sudden, unexplained cardiac arrest following their routine procedure. So, as Dr. Marsden went back inside and began heading upstairs to the hospital administrator's office to tell them about this latest emergency, he kept thinking to himself how crazy it was that he had just witnessed these two unexplained sudden cardiac arrests basically back to back. But Dr. Marsden just thought to himself, hopefully this is just a really bad coincidence. The Surgicare Center's administrator was a woman named Ashley Burks, and when she heard about this second unexplained cardiac arrest, she knew she had to call a staff meeting. And so that evening, she, along with Dr. Marsden and over 24 other medical staff, doctors, nurses, other anesthesiologists, they met in this conference room in the back of the building. And once everybody was assembled, Ashley began by updating everyone on the two patients who had been rushed off to the hospital for their cardiac emergencies, and she said they had stabilized and they'd be okay. But Ashley then said what everybody in the room was thinking, which is sudden unexplained cardiac arrest is so rare, we can't just treat these things like coincidence. Like something specifically must have caused these incidents, and we need to figure out what that thing was. Now, it was possible that the cause or causes behind these incidents were quite simple. Ashley said to the group, the first thing she did was she looked at the two patients' files to see if they had specific drug allergies or medical risk factors that might have been overlooked by staff. But when she looked at their files, neither patient had those risk factors or allergies, so that couldn't have been it. Ashley said she also looked for just a common thread between these two incidents. Like, were the patients doing something similar? Were they in for similar reasons? Were they in the same room? But no, they were in different operating rooms, going through different procedures with different medical teams. And so there was no obvious common thread between the two incidents. So Ashley said to the group that the only reasonable explanation that she could think of, at least at this point, was that perhaps the equipment in the Surgicare Center had malfunctioned. And so what she was going to do, out of an abundance of caution, was just begin testing all of the equipment in the building. And so Ashley told the group that in the meantime, while she was doing that, the rest of the staff should be extra attentive to their patients and also be on the lookout for potential problems with hospital equipment. Ashley watched the medical staff all nod their heads in agreement and begin sort of talking to each other, and then she thanked them all for being there and told them they could leave. 3 weeks later, on the afternoon of June 22nd, Ashley stood outside the OR in the hallway, looking through a cabinet that contained surgical drugs. Ashley was still trying to find a connection between those two sudden cardiac arrests. She'd already checked all the SurgiCare Center's equipment, from the anesthesia machines to the vital sign monitors to the breathing tubes, and everything was in perfect working condition. And so now, checking these drugs inside of this cabinet was sort of like her last resort. She'd printed out a list of recent drug recalls and was now comparing that list against all of the drugs inside of this cabinet. And so one by one, she was reading a drug and checking the date on it and comparing it with her list to make sure, they were not carrying recalled drugs still. But after going through dozens and dozens of bottles, there was nothing in their cabinet that was on the recall list. So Ashley still just did not have an answer for why those two cardiac emergencies had happened. However, since that staff meeting 3 weeks earlier, the SurgiCare Center had not had another cardiac emergency. And so Ashley was thinking to herself, maybe, despite not knowing how this happened, these troubles are in the past. Ashley shut the drug cabinet and walked down the hallway towards the break room to grab her lunch. But the moment she walked inside, she saw a group of her colleagues sitting around a table looking very upset. In fact, some people were visibly crying. And so Ashley walked up to them and said, "Hey, what's going on?" And a nurse told her that one of their colleagues, an anesthesiologist named Dr. Melanie Kaspar, was dead. Apparently, the night before, she had had a heart attack at her home, and her husband had found her and called 911, but unfortunately, by the time paramedics arrived, she was already deceased. Ashley was shocked. She knew Dr. Kaspar, and she knew she was in great shape. She was only in her mid-50s. She did not seem like someone who might just randomly have a heart attack. But Ashley did remember that over the last few days, she had heard that Dr. Kaspar was not feeling well. And so Ashley wondered if maybe, her heart attack had something to do with that. Either way, as the SurgiCare administrator, it was Ashley's job to plan staff events like memorial services, and so Ashley told the group, hey, I'll get to work putting together a small ceremony for Dr. Kaspar. 5 days later, on June 27th, Ashley was sitting in front of her office computer ordering supplies for Dr. Kaspar's memorial when suddenly she heard these loud, fast footsteps out in the hall as if somebody was sprinting towards her office. And then a moment later, Ashley saw her door burst open and the anesthesiologist, Dr. Chad Marsden, was standing there, and he looked absolutely horrified, and he just said to her, "It's happening again." Ashley's stomach dropped, and she jumped up and sprinted after Dr. Marsden, and they made their way to the hallway outside of the OR. And when they got there, Ashley immediately heard the sound of that long single beep of somebody's heart monitor flatlining, and she looked over and she saw one of the doors to an operating room was open, and inside she saw a surgeon performing chest compressions on an elderly patient. And even from out in the hall, Ashley could tell this man was unconscious, his skin was gray, and he was foaming at the mouth. It was exactly like the other cardiac emergencies that had happened before, except this time was worse, because that beep, that flatlining beep, meant that this man's heart had actually stopped. And so Ashley just stood there in horror, watching the surgeon perform these chest compressions, knowing that if that didn't work, if they couldn't get this man's heart started again, he was about to die. Just then, Ashley heard the sound of the doors leading into the OR hallway open, and these two paramedics came rushing inside, and right as they passed her and got to the doorway leading into where this man was basically dying, Ashley heard the sound of the flatline beep turn into regular beeping, which meant the surgeon who was doing chest compressions had managed to restart this man's heart. And so Ashley was relieved, but by no means thought they're out of the woods yet. This man clearly is going through a medical emergency here. But the paramedics got the man off the OR table, they put him on a stretcher, and they wheeled him away. And so once they were gone, Ashley, Dr. Marsden, and the surgeon who'd been doing the chest compressions, they all just looked at each other like, what is going on here? Clearly, there is something causing all these sudden cardiac arrests, but still nobody knew what it was. Ashley just stood there for a moment, feeling absolutely sick to her stomach. If it wasn't the drugs, and if it wasn't the medical equipment that caused these sudden cardiac arrests, then what was it? Well, Ashley was determined to find out. Over the next 2 months, Ashley interviewed and observed every single employee of the SurgiCare Center to make sure they really were following their protocol absolutely to a T. And one after another, through her research, she discovered that they all were. They were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. So the cardiac arrests could not be chalked up to faulty equipment, recalled drugs, or human error. And yet, the cardiac emergencies kept on happening at the Surgicare Center. There were 3 incidents in July and 4 more incidents in the first 3 weeks of August. And so in total, that made 10 patients at the Surgicare Center who had all gone into sudden unexplained cardiac arrest. Now, none of them had died, but Ashley knew a few of them had been left with permanent heart damage. People were getting seriously injured on her watch, and she felt like, she can't figure out what's going on here, and so it's just a matter of time until somebody does die from one of these cardiac emergencies, and so she was feeling completely overwhelmed and stressed out and desperate. Until August 24th, when 2 things happened in quick succession. First, in the morning of August 24th, Ashley received a phone call from an officer at the Dallas Police Department, and they told her that the autopsy had been completed on Dr. Melanie Kaspar, the anesthesiologist who had died back in June from a heart attack at her home. And this police officer thought that Ashley really needed to know that her heart attack had not been natural. It was actually caused by an overdose of a drug called bupivacaine. So Ashley knew what bupivacaine was. It was a drug that was basically only used in surgical anesthesia. But Ashley had never heard of anybody abusing this drug or overdosing on it because bupivacaine does not make you high like morphine or fentanyl does. It's closer to Novocaine. It's like a numbing agent. And so Ashley told the officer how weird it was, the idea that she had died of an overdose of bupivacaine of all drugs, and the officer agreed with her. But regardless, he thought Ashley should know because he thought it was possible that Dr. Kaspar had gotten the bupivacaine from the Surgicare Center. And so feeling totally confused, Ashley thanked the officer for telling her, then they hung up, and then Ashley walked to the OR hallway to check the drug cabinet where drugs like bupivacaine were stored. But as soon as she entered that hallway, the second thing happened that day. Ashley heard chaos break out inside of an operating room where she knew an 18-year-old boy was undergoing what should have been a routine sinus surgery. And so she watched helplessly as the doors flung open and a nurse came running out into the hall to call an ambulance. And then inside the room, Ashley saw an anesthesiologist performing chest compressions on this boy, and another doctor was administering oxygen and blood pressure medication. It was the same nightmare playing out now for an 11th time. But this time, after the EMTs wheeled this boy away to be driven off to the local hospital, Ashley was so desperate to figure out what was going on here that she just couldn't wait. And so she rounded up a couple of hospital staffers that were nearby, and they went into that operating room, and they checked the medical equipment, they checked the drugs that had been used, they searched the floor for anything that might have had something to do with this. I mean, they even searched the trash can. And in the trash, Ashley found something that the second she saw it, it made her blood run cold. She couldn't believe somebody would do something this awful or why they would do this. And so she took the thing she found in the trash and she ran out of the operating room and upstairs to call the police. Minutes later, 2 police officers arrived at the Surgicare Center and they saw what Ashley had found in the trash. And when they looked at it, they knew they had a very serious situation on their hands. And so right away, they roped off the operating room where this 18-year-old boy had been, and they began looking for evidence inside of there. And then also, they began reviewing the security camera footage from the OR hallway. And as they reviewed this footage, they would find something truly chilling going on in that hallway that totally explained all of the sudden cardiac arrests that had been happening inside the Surgicare Center. This is what they saw on the clearest piece of footage, which was shot 5 days earlier on August 19th. A hospital employee is seen walking down the OR hallway carrying a stack of papers under his arm. He walks past a couple of his colleagues, and he arrives in front of this big metallic device that sort of looks like a refrigerator, and he opens it up, and he reaches inside, and he pulls out a saline IV bag. Now, when he does this, nobody else in the hallway bats an eye, because this is a totally normal thing to do. That metal device was a warming machine where saline IV bags were stored to be used during or after surgeries. At any given point, this warmer would contain a few dozen IV bags, and whenever it got low, certain staff members would restock it. But the police watched this footage over and over again, and they saw this employee who walks up to the warmer was not just carrying a stack of papers. He was also hiding something within those papers, his own saline IV bag. And so before this man takes out an IV bag from the warmer, he takes this hidden one and places it in the warmer as well. So he's basically swapped one for one. And this was absolutely bizarre because it was not his job to be restocking the warmer. He shouldn't have been putting anything inside of the warmer. And so about 30 minutes after this employee has placed his own IV bag inside of the warmer, a nurse comes out of the OR, walks down the hallway, opens up the warmer, takes one of the warmed up IV bags, carries it down the hall, goes back into the OR, and minutes later, her patient goes into cardiac arrest. It would turn out that nurse had inadvertently grabbed the saline bag that the male employee had secretly placed just minutes before. And she didn't know that that saline bag is what caused the cardiac arrest. Nobody knew until days later when Ashley is so desperate to figure out why all these patients are going into cardiac arrest that she began searching through the trash, and she would find an empty IV bag, and she would see very clearly there was a little puncture on it, just big enough for a needle. And so after seeing this security footage, the police analyzed that empty IV bag that Ashley had found in the trash with the puncture on it to see exactly what was in that IV that went into the 18-year-old who also went into cardiac arrest. And inside, they found a combination of 3 drugs that, when combined, are like a biological bomb that will send somebody into cardiac arrest within minutes. They were lidocaine, which is an anesthetic, epinephrine, which is basically pure adrenaline, and crucially, the third drug found was bupivacaine, the anesthetic that Dr. Melanie Kaspar had overdosed on, which caused her to die of a heart attack. And this discovery meant that Dr. Kaspar's death was almost certainly connected to these poisoned IV bags. In the few days before Dr. Kaspar's death, she had been feeling sick and dehydrated. And on the day of her death, she was feeling so unwell at work that, unbeknownst to any of her colleagues, she had taken a saline IV bag from that warmer and brought it home with her to rehydrate herself. But unfortunately, the one that she grabbed was one of the poisoned ones. When paramedics arrived at Dr. Kaspar's home, they found her still with the IV needle in her arm. But at the time, nobody connected her death with all of the cardiac emergencies at the Surgicare Center. Well, nobody except for the employee who was actually poisoning the IV bags. That employee was an anesthesiologist, but it was not Dr. Chad Marsden. It was the person that Dr. Marsden had to get out of the way for in the hallway that first time his patient had gone into cardiac arrest. The man who was doing the tampering was Dr. Reynaldo Ortiz. He was 58 years old, and he had only worked at the Surgicare Center for about a year. And he had flown mostly under the radar there until May 19th of 2022, which was about a week before the sudden, unexplained cardiac arrests had begun at the Surgicare Center. On that day, on May 19th, Dr. Ortiz had allowed one of his patients to stop breathing, nearly killing the patient. And so as a result of that incident, Dr. Ortiz had been placed under internal investigation by the Surgicare Center, and he was facing the possibility of losing his medical license because of negligence. So to try to avoid losing his medical license, Dr. Ortiz decided he would just try to make all the other doctors look negligent too, taking the attention off of himself. And so he began sabotaging his colleagues' surgeries by injecting those drugs into their patients' IV bags, knowing it would cause cardiac arrest. Now, none of the patients who went into cardiac arrest at the Surgicare Center died. However, Dr. Kaspar, who took that tampered IV bag home with her, did die. And so ultimately, Dr. Ortiz was responsible for her death. In April of 2024, Dr. Ortiz was found guilty on multiple charges, and he is currently facing a sentence of up to 190 years in prison. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.
In your eyes, shining so bright. Your cute girl voice speaks like rapid fire. In this vibrant world, there's no need to tire. Scene-driven beats taking us higher, lost in the rhythm, feeling inspired. Dancing with you, here by my side. In this your groove, our hearts collide.
The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole